Janet Jackson engineered the perfect revenge while her ex-husband was dragging her through a $10 million divorce. She didn't write a bitter, angry breakup record. She wrote the most unapologetically joyful album of her career. And by the end of it, she hadn't just won a Grammy and become the first ever MTV Icon, she'd outsold Michael. There's a photograph from the All For You album shoot that tells you everything. Janet's lying on a white bed, bare shoulders, looking directly into the camera. And she's smiling. Not a performance smile, not a choreographed pop star moment. An actual, genuine, unguarded grin. If you put it next to the Velvet Rope cover from 4 years earlier, where her face is half hidden behind a curtain of hair, head lowered, eyes averted, you'd think you were looking at two different people. And in a lot of ways, you would be. She told interviewers at the time, and the exact phrasing matters here,
no longer married. I hope it doesn't sound badly to say that that was the inspiration, but because I'm in a different space, it's like I'm being introduced to a whole new world.
A whole new world. She'd been famous since she was a child. She'd been secretly married for nearly a decade, and she was describing her own life like she was discovering it for the first time. Because between those two album covers, Janet Jackson's life had quietly and then very publicly fallen apart. The marriage she'd hidden for years, denied on camera, denied to Oprah, denied to everyone, had collapsed. Her creative partner and husband, René Elizondo Jr, hadn't just left. He'd filed a lawsuit demanding $10 million, and in doing so, blown the secrecy wide open. Every tabloid had the story. Every interview circled back to it. The woman who had spent her entire career meticulously controlling her image suddenly had no control over the biggest story in her personal life. So the question hanging over the All For You sessions wasn't really a musical one. It was personal. What does Janet Jackson sound like when the armor comes off? Not because she chose to remove it, but because someone ripped it away. The answer, and this is what makes this album so fascinating, is that she doesn't sound wounded. She doesn't sound bitter. Not on most of it, anyway. She sounds free. Genuinely, recklessly, almost stubbornly free. And that was a deliberate choice. Because the easy album to make in 2001, after everything she'd been through, would have been Velvet Rope Part 2. Another confessional. Another dark night of the soul. The label would have accepted it. The critics would have praised it. And Janet looked at that option and said, absolutely not. Not this time. Instead, she went backwards. 70s funk, 80s disco, warm, analog, and human. She brought in a new collaborator named Rockwilder, alongside her long-standing partners Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and together they built something that sounded like nothing else on the radio that year. Not because it was ahead of its time, but because it deliberately, joyfully refused to care what time it was. And it worked. The title track topped the Hot 100 all summer. The Grammy voters took notice. The industry started treating her like a fixed point in the culture again. But what happened next, what was coming just 3 years down the road, makes this entire chapter of Janet's career land completely differently in hindsight. But we'll get there. First, we need to go back to where this album was actually born. Inside a divorce, inside a studio, and inside the mind of a woman who decided that happiness was the best possible form of revenge. The Velvet Rope nearly broke her. All For You is what she built afterwards. Janet had always been disciplined about the gap between albums. 2 years, 3 years, enough time to live, enough time to accumulate something worth saying. But the 4-year stretch between Velvet Rope in 1997 and All For You in 2001 wasn't a creative choice. It was recovery time. The Velvet Rope had been the most emotionally exposed work of her career. Depression, loneliness, domestic violence, queer identity, self-harm. She pulled back every curtain and let the audience see the full, unfiltered reality of what was happening inside her head. Critics praised it. Fans connected with it on a visceral level. It's still widely regarded as her most artistically complete record, but making it had cost her something. You don't write an album that raw and walk away clean. And while she was processing the emotional aftermath of that record, her private life was detonating in real time. René Elizondo Jr. had been part of Janet's world for over a decade. He wasn't just her husband, he was embedded in the creative machinery. He directed music videos, including That's the Way Love Goes and Together Again. He'd been one of the key songwriters on the Velvet Rope. Their professional and personal lives were so thoroughly intertwined that separating one from the other was going to be surgical and messy. When the divorce was finally announced and Elizondo initiated it in 2000, the secrecy of it all made the fallout worse. It wasn't just a breakup, the news was a revelation. The press had a field day, not just with the split, but with the lie. How had she hidden an entire marriage? Why? And what else wasn't she telling us?
Why did you not want people to know you were married?
We just kept it private. Right. It was just a very private thing. We never told anyone. And we I think one or two people in my family knew. We just ran off and kind of did it.
Then came the lawsuit. $10 million. Elizondo claimed he was owed a share of her earnings, her property, her creative output. For a woman who had built her entire identity around self-determination, who had literally named an album Control, this was about as invasive as it gets. Her most private relationship, the one she'd fought hardest to protect, was now playing out in depositions and tabloid headlines. So by the time Janet walked back into Flyte Tyme Studios with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis in late '99 and early 2000, the emotional landscape was complicated. She was hurt, angry, legally embattled, and by her own account, the happiest she'd been in years. That contradiction is the engine of the entire album, because Janet didn't experience the divorce as just a loss. She experienced it as an unburdening. The secrecy was gone. The performance of a hidden marriage was over. And for the first time since she was a teenager, she was answerable to nobody. Not a husband, not a family narrative, not the expectations that came with being a Jackson, just herself. The album was a lot of fun to make, she said later, and there's something almost defiant about the simplicity of that statement. After The Velvet Rope, an album that was grueling to create and emotionally harrowing to promote, fun was a radical act. She wasn't interested in giving the audience another dark chapter. She wanted to make a record that felt like driving with the windows down. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who'd been with her since Control in '86, understood the assignment immediately. They'd shepherded her through every era, every reinvention, every emotional phase. They knew when to push and when to follow. And on All For You, they followed. Janet wanted warmth. Not that kind of warmth. She wanted groove. She wanted the kind of music she'd grown up hearing in the Jackson household. 70s funk, 80s disco, the kind of records that made you move before you even processed the lyrics. This was a genuinely counterintuitive move in 2001. The pop landscape that year was dominated by sleek, digital, forward-looking production. Britney's Britney was leaning into Swedish pop electronic hybrids. NSYNC's Celebrity was chasing Neptune-style futurism. Madonna had gone full electronica on music. The prevailing wisdom was that pop needed to sound like the future to survive. Janet looked at all of that and reached for the past instead. And then she did something that she hadn't done in 15 years. She brought in an outside producer. Rockwilder, Dana Stinson, was known primarily for his hip-hop work with Method Man and Redman. He was not an obvious fit for a Janet Jackson album, but that was precisely the point. Since Control, every Janet album had been built almost exclusively within the Jam and Lewis ecosystem. Rhythm Nation, Janet, The Velvet Rope, all of them came out of Flyte Tyme. All of them bore that same architectural DNA. Bringing Rockwilder in for 6 tracks wasn't just a sonic decision, it was a statement. The old rules no longer applied. The old partnerships, the old power structures, the old ways of working, Janet was willing to disrupt all of it. Rockwilder brought a rougher, more rhythmically aggressive energy to the sessions.
That's when I worked with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, that's when I came back. It was kind of like I came off the boundary. Was Moses with the commandments. I just felt like I had been learned from like some of the best in the world of music. History. They made it history. So, you know, they gave me their blessings and they sent me back to the hip hop game.
Tracks like You Ain't Right and Come On Get Up had a swagger and a grit that felt different from the polished Jam and Lewis sound. Not better and not worse, just new. and new was exactly what Janet was chasing. A new collaborator, a new creative dynamic, a new version of herself that wasn't defined by the partnerships or the marriage she was leaving behind. The album was taking shape as two records in one. On one side, sunshine, liberation, the joy of being single and unaccountable and alive. On the other, fury, betrayal, and the very specific anger of a woman who gave someone her trust and watched them try to monetize it. Both of those emotions were real. Both of them were happening simultaneously. And rather than choose one lane, Janet and her producers leaned into the whiplash. That tension between the ecstatic and the vengeful is what gives All For You its pulse, its beating heart. And before any of this reached the public, there was one more piece to place. A bridge between the old era and the new one. A single that nobody planned as a statement record, but that ended up announcing the entire All For You era before the album even had a title. That bridge was Doesn't Really Matter. Doesn't Really Matter arrived in the summer of 2000, a full 9 months before All For You even had a release date. It was never planned as a mission statement. Janet had been offered the chance to write a song for Nutty Professor 2, The Clumps, the Eddie Murphy comedy she was also starring in. She nearly turned it down. She said she'd only do it if she found the right song. Director Peter Segal brought a rough cut of the film to Flyte Tyme Studios to help inspire her. And what came out of that session was something light, busy, and almost disarmingly sweet. 2 choruses were written for that song. Jimmy Jam came up with the... Janet came up with... They went with Janet's, obviously, and tucked Jam's version near the end of the song as a playful callback. Segal picked it over 2 other demos because he thought it sounded like summer. And he was right. It topped the Hot 100 for 3 consecutive weeks, became her 9th US #1, and made her only the 3rd female artist after Madonna and Whitney Houston to have 19 gold certified singles. Not bad for a soundtrack cut. And more importantly, it set the tone. When listeners heard Doesn't Really Matter in cinemas and on the radio throughout the summer of 2000, they were hearing a very specific version of Janet. Unbothered, buoyant, and almost giddy. That was the energy she wanted to carry forward. And when the album arrived the following April, the title track made good on that promise immediately. All For You is pure disco funk joy. There's no other way to describe it. Built around a sample of Change's 1980 single, The Glow of Love, it's warm and propulsive and unapologetically retro in a way that felt almost rebellious in 2001. The production glows. Jam and Lewis laid the original sample and let Janet's vocal sit right in the pocket of the groove, playful and flirtatious.
You got a nice package, alright, 'cause I'm gonna have to ride it tonight.
Delivered with that signature Janet half whisper, half grin. It's cheeky, it's fun. It sounds like a woman who's decided that tonight is going to be a good night and she doesn't need anyone's permission for it. And here's the thing, if you know your pop history for that year, the sonic DNA is fascinatingly close to what Mariah Carey was doing on Loverboy at almost exactly the same time. How different things could have been. Same era, same instinct, same reach back into 80s disco funk as a source of joy. 2 of the biggest voices in pop music independently arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment. The future of pop in 2001 sounded best when it borrowed from 1982. A cultural correction in real time happening on 2 records at once with very different outcomes. But All For You isn't just the title track. And one of the things I genuinely love about this record is how the interludes shape the whole experience. If you've listened to The Velvet Rope, you'll remember those interludes as heavy and depressive and emotionally charged. They carried the weight of the album's themes in concentrated doses. On All For You, the interludes are doing something completely different. They're funny, they're light. Little skits and spoken moments that feel like Janet messing around with her mates in the studio, and they give the album a personality that singles alone can't communicate. They make it feel lived in, like you're not just hearing a collection of tracks, you're spending time with someone who's genuinely enjoying herself.
Are you guys recording our conversation? I get the feeling you are. Are you, Jimmy?
That energy carries through on Come On Get Up, and it's one of my favorite tracks on the record. It's a Rockwilder co-production, so it's got that slightly rougher rhythmic edge compared to the Jam and Lewis material, but the spirit is pure celebration.
I love that song. That song makes me want to dance instantly. Come on, get up. A little house feel. I just envisioned that being in a club and just wanting to ask someone to dance. It's about feeling free and just having a good time.
And if you're a Janet fan, there's a ghost in this track. It's a sonic sister to Together Again. Same euphoric, upward energy, same insistence on joy as a physical experience. But where Together Again was written about loss, about a friend who died from AIDS, about finding happiness through grief, Come On Get Up has none of that emotional undercurrent. It's joy without the ache, joy for its own sake. And honestly, as a workout track, it's absolutely relentless. Keep moving on the treadmill. It doesn't let you stop. Then there's the other side of the record, the divorce side. Truth is the track where Janet stops smiling and starts staking her claim. Built around an interpolation of the 5 stair steps, Ooh Child, it takes a song most people associate with comfort and optimism and turns it into something pointed. This isn't Janet processing her feelings about the end of the marriage. This is Janet looking directly at the situation, the lawsuit, the money, the attempt to claim credit for her success, and responding with cold, factual authority.
I had a few hits before, now tonight.
That line lands like a legal deposition delivered over a funk bass line. She's not arguing, she's not pleading, she's reminding everyone, including Elizondo, that her career existed long before he entered the room and would continue long after he left it. And then, right at the end, the record does something beautiful. Better Days closes the album with a gentleness that earns every second of its runtime. After the disco highs and the divorce fury and the playful interludes, Janet brings everything down to a whisper. It's a promise to herself, really, that she's leaving the pain behind, that she's choosing forward motion, that whatever comes next, she's going to meet it without the weight of what came before. And the outro is so lovely, so deliberately soothing, and it almost functions as a lullaby. Not for a child, but for Janet herself, a woman putting an entire chapter of her life to bed and being at peace with it. Would You Mind leans further into the erotic lane than the rest of the record really supports, and for me, it always felt slightly disconnected from the emotional through line. It feels so right. It's a grower, not a shower. One of those tracks that sits quietly in the middle of the track list for years, and then one day you hear it differently and suddenly you understand exactly what it's doing there. It's the exhale between the highs. And an album this emotionally varied needs those breathing spaces. What ties all of this together, the funk, the fury, the interludes, the tenderness, is the fact that Janet and her producers never tried to smooth out the contradictions. They let the album be messy in the way that real human recovery is messy. Happy 1 minute, furious the next, flirtatious after that, and contemplative by the end. And that's not a flaw. It's in the track listing. That's the whole point. And by the time the album was ready to go, Virgin Records had an album that was going to be very, very easy to sell. Virgin Records knew what they had. The rollout for All For You was engineered to feel like an event, and the groundwork had already been laid. Doesn't Really Matter had spent the previous summer reminding everybody that Janet Jackson was still capable of dominating the Hot 100. The question was never, will the album sell? It was whether it could re-establish Janet as the main conversation in pop. The album dropped on April 24th, 2001, and the answer came immediately. All For You debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, #1 on the R&B albums chart, #2 in the UK. 25 years into her career, 15 years after Control rewrote the rules, and Janet was still opening at the top. That in itself was a statement in an industry increasingly obsessed with youth, with the Britneys and the Christinas and the Destinys. A woman in her mid-30s walking straight to #1 wasn't supposed to happen, and Janet made it look routine. The title track had already been doing some serious damage. All For You entered the Hot 100 like it owned the building and stayed at #1 for 7 weeks. Seven. In a year crowded with massive singles, Destiny's Child, Alicia Keys, Missy Elliott, all competing for airspace, Janet's disco funk throwback just sat there at the top and refused to move. It peaked at #3 in the UK and burned through radio playlists on both sides of the Atlantic. The Grammy voters took notice. It won Best Dance Recording at the 44th Annual Grammy Awards, which, for a track built on a 21-year-old Change sample and produced by the same team she'd been working with since the Reagan administration, felt like a validation of the entire creative philosophy behind the record. Someone to Call My Lover followed as the second single in June, and this is where the production storytelling gets genuinely interesting. The track is built around a looped guitar riff from America's 1972 hit Ventura Highway, a sample Janet had never heard before Jimmy Jam played it for her.
He said, I want to play you something, and he played me this loop. He goes, you know what this is? And I'm going, no. He goes, Jan, you don't know what this is? I'm going, no. I said, I feel badly, because obviously I should recognize it. He goes, America, Ventura, Highway, the whole... I was like, Jimmy, I don't know. I felt so badly because I didn't know the song.
But layered underneath the chorus is something far more personal. An interpolation of Eric Sadie's Gymnopedie No. 1, rewritten from Waltz Time into 4/4, and the story behind it is one of those details that makes you see an artist completely differently. Janet had first heard the Sadie piece as a child. She used to come home from school and watched old MGM musicals on a program called the 3:30 Movie, and there was a commercial. She thought it might have been for Dove that used the melody. She never knew who wrote it. She never knew the name, but it stayed in her head for years. Then, one day, she was in a Ralph Lauren store and heard it playing over the speakers. She practically begged the staff to tell her what it was. They gave her the CD, and she took it straight to Jimmy Jam and said, I've just got to share this with you. He put his own flavor on it, but the emotional thread was Janet's. A melody she'd carried since childhood, finally finding its way into a song about searching for love as an adult. Someone to Call My Lover peaked at number 3 on the Hot 100, and if you listen closely, you can hear that childhood longing sitting right underneath the breezy, sun-drenched production. Then came Son of a Gun, I Bet You Think This Song Is About You. And this is where the album's other emotional register, the divorce fury, got its moment in the spotlight. Janet called Carly Simon directly to ask permission to sample You're So Vain. Simon didn't just agree, she wanted in. She re-recorded her vocals, wrote new lines, rapped on the track, thinking the producers would never actually use it, and then watched as Janet and Jam married both recordings together into something that felt like 2 generations of women calling out the same kind of man. The remix, featuring Missy Elliott, pushed it further into hip-hop territory, and the media, predictably, spent weeks speculating about whether the song was aimed at Elizondo. Janet's response was characteristically measured. The song's about a few people, not one person in particular, she said. But nobody was buying the diplomacy. And honestly, the ambiguity made it a better single. Son of a Gun didn't match the chart performance of its predecessors. It peaked at number 28 on the Hot 100, Janet's lowest charting single since 1983, and her first to miss the top 10 since Control. But this wasn't a reflection of the song. Virgin Records was hemorrhaging money in late 2001, and the promotional campaign for All For You was abruptly cut short. You might recall they had to pay Mariah Carey a significant sum of money to buy her out of her deal. The label simply stopped spending. In the UK, where the promo infrastructure held up slightly longer, Son of a Gun actually outperformed Michael's simultaneously released single Cry. Janet peaked at number 13 and Michael at number 25. A small detail, but a telling one. And there's a footnote to the Son of a Gun video that's too good not to mention. Britney Spears, a self-described Janet admirer, watched that video, shot at the Millennium Biltmore Hotel, and the following year recreated it almost beat for beat for her overprotected Darkchild remix visual. Same hotel lobby, same choreographic energy, same visual language. When the biggest pop star on the planet is borrowing your aesthetic for her own singles, that tells you something about where the cultural influence was actually flowing. But the true coronation didn't happen on a chart. It happened on a stage. In 2001, MTV launched a new annual special called MTV Icon, a tribute format where the industry's biggest names would honor a single artist for their cultural impact. And for the first, the inaugural, the one that would set the template for every tribute that followed, they chose Janet Jackson. Not Madonna, not Michael, not Prince, Janet Jackson. It was the industry saying out loud what the charts had been whispering all year, that Janet Jackson had earned her place not as Michael's sister, not as a Jackson, but as the architect of her own legacy. And the fact that it happened during the All For You era, during the album where she finally chose herself, is almost too poetic. She was, at that exact moment, at the absolute peak of her powers. And then she took the show on the road. The All For You tour was supposed to be a victory lap. By the time it launched on July 7, 2001, Janet had a #1 album, a chart-topping single, and a Grammy on the way. The tour was the physical manifestation of all of it. The moment where the woman who'd spent 2 years in the studio rebuilding herself finally got to stand in front of an audience and feel the result. But there was an omen right at the start. The first scheduled show was indefinitely postponed before it could even happen. At the time, it looked like a routine production delay, the kind of thing that happens with any major arena tour. In hindsight, it reads differently. The All For You tour was never going to get a clean run. For the first 2 months, none of that mattered. The shows were enormous. Janet brought a production designed around the album's emotional arc, joy, freedom, sensuality, catharsis. And the audiences responded the way audiences always responded to Janet on stage. She'd been performing since she was a child. She knew how to command a room. And the All For You material, with its disco funk warmth and its celebratory undercurrent, translated to live performance better than almost anything she'd done since Rhythm Nation. The crowd was there for the joy, and she gave them the joy they wanted. Then, September 11th happened. Janet was scheduled to perform in Tampa, Florida that night. The show was postponed. So was every other tour in America that week. The country stopped, and when it slowly started moving again, the cultural temperature had completely changed. Stadium pop spectacles suddenly felt out of place. Audiences were grieving. Travel was complicated. Insurance for international tours became a nightmare. And Janet, like every other major artist on the road that autumn, had to make hard decisions about what could continue and what couldn't. The European leg was cancelled on October 1st, 2001, with safety concerns cited explicitly in the wake of 9/11. For the British and European fans who'd been waiting years for Janet to come back, the Velvet Rope Tour had been her last full international run. The cancellation hit hard. There was no rescheduling, no promise of a return visit. Just an abrupt full stop on what was supposed to be the global celebration of her biggest record in years. And here's where the All For You era starts to feel, in retrospect, like a story about doors quietly closing. The tour cut short. The Virgin promotional budget evaporating. The single campaign for Son of a Gun stranded mid-rollout. None of these things were Janet's fault. They were external forces. A financially imploding label, a global tragedy, an industry in flux. And they all converged on this one record at exactly the wrong moment. But what didn't get cancelled was the cultural impact. And this is where All For You matters most. Because what Janet was doing in 2001, at 35, freshly divorced, taking creative risks, refusing to chase the youth market, openly rejecting the futurist pop aesthetic that everyone around her was adopting, was rewriting the playbook for what a black woman in pop music was allowed to be. Tina Turner had cracked open the door with Private Dancer in 1984, proving that a woman in her mid-40s could come back commanding stadiums. Janet pushed it further. Nobody framed her as a comeback. She was simply current, present, dominant, undeniable, and her age never entered the conversation. The blueprint she laid down in this era is everywhere now. Look at Rihanna's transition from rated R to loud. The dark, vulnerable confessional album followed by the bright, defiantly joyful pivot. That's the Velvet Rope to All For You sequence, almost beat for beat. Look at how Beyoncé moved through her 30s, refusing to be confined to a single genre or a single emotional register. Look at Ciara, Solange, Dawn Richard, Tinashe, Kalela, Doja Cat. All of them artists who move fluidly between pop and R&B, between vulnerability and celebration, between commercial ambition and artistic risk. Every one of them is operating in a space that Janet helped construct. And the through line connecting all of it isn't a sound. It's a permission structure. All For You was Janet saying to herself, to the industry, to every black woman watching, you don't have to choose between being commercially massive and being emotionally honest. You don't have to sacrifice one phase of your artistry to enter the next one. You can be 35 and joyful and grieving and sexy and angry and brilliant all at once. And the audience will follow you if you trust them to. That's what All For You gave the women who came after her. Not a sound, a blueprint for how to occupy your own life on your own terms. And for one more brief glittering moment before the world tilted on its axis in February 2004, Janet Jackson was the woman every other woman in pop was watching. So how do we measure All For You now, 25 years later? On paper, the numbers tell one story. Double platinum in the US, a Billboard 200 #1 debut, a 7-week chart-topping single, a Grammy, the 25th best-selling album of 2001 in America, an MTV Icon coronation. Every metric you'd want from a major label pop record in its peak era, All For You delivered. But the deeper measurement is what the album refused to be. It wasn't a Velvet Rope sequel, and it wasn't a chase after the futurist pop sound dominating 2001. There's no sense anywhere on it of a woman playing defense. No hedging, no retreat into safer commercial territory after a difficult personal chapter. Janet made the album she wanted to make, with the collaborators she wanted, in the sound she wanted, about the emotions she was actually feeling. Joy and fury, side by side, and no apologies for either. That's a kind of artistic confidence that gets harder to access the longer you stay famous. Most artists, 15 years into a career, start playing defense. Janet went the opposite direction. She brought in a new producer for the first time since Control. She reached backwards into the music she'd loved as a child instead of forwards into whatever was trending. She let the contradictions sit on the same track list without trying to resolve them. She trusted her audience to come with her, and the audience did. The album sold. The singles charted. The tour, until the world intervened, was packing arenas. For one full calendar year, Janet Jackson was operating at the absolute peak of her commercial and creative powers, completely on her own terms, completely free of the marriage and the secrecy and the emotional weight that had defined the previous era. That freedom is what All For You preserves. Whatever happened afterwards, and a lot happened afterwards that we'll get to on this channel, this album exists as proof of what Janet Jackson was capable of when she gave herself permission to be happy. But to understand why that permission mattered so much, you have to go back 8 years to the album where she first took control of her own image, her own sexuality, and her own story. The album where the secret marriage was just the beginning. The album that made everything we just talked about possible. In 1991, Janet Jackson signed the biggest recording contract in music history, then used it to stage a 1993 takeover. Financial, creative, and cultural, all at once. Get the full story of Janet, period, right here.